As a host of CBC Television's business and financial programs, including CBC Morning and appearing on the Lang and O'Leary Exchange, Danielle Bochove has shown the ability to connect with audiences, as she will today, and synthesize complex stories with flair. I mean, she's cool. She was multimedia before it was in fashion, with over 15 years of experience in 5 countries and on 3 different continents: North America, Europe, and Asia. And she's conducted over 10,000 interviews on the trading floors of the world's top exchanges, in corporate boardrooms, and in government offices. You can't throw her off her game, and she could probably kick your butt in Scrabble. Bochove began her career in Canada with the Globe and Mail and the Financial Post, and then she moved to Reuters' Tokyo Bureau as the Asian economic crisis was breaking, contributing award-winning coverage to the financial meltdown and interviewing finance ministers and central bankers throughout the region. And maybe she gave them a stock tip or two, because everything's turned around and now China owns everything except the Boston Pizza I'm going to have lunch at later today. Today she freelances for the Economist Intelligence Unit and Maclean's Magazine, and she can be seen tomorrow night on the co-hosting the Lang and O'Leary Exchange on CBC. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Danielle Bochove.
We'll play Scrabble. It's always a little surprising to see so many actual people when I do these things, because when I'm in the studio, of course, you know, the audience at home could be hundreds of thousands of people, but I only actually have to look at a couple of camera guys and a floor director. So to make it a little easier on myself, if you don't mind, I thought today that I'm going to think of this side of the room as camera 1, camera 2. You people in the middle can be the floor director, which means you should spend the next 20 minutes eating a sandwich and tweeting. I've been a journalist for almost 20 years, primarily business, although I've covered just about everything at some point. Roughly half my career has been outside Canada, and most of that has been spent covering some sort of economic meltdown, a crisis. One of the things I've noticed in recent years, and there's been a lot written about this lately, is the fact that the business world seems to be approaching catastrophe increasingly often. I think there are a lot of reasons for that, and one of the big ones is the fact that never before in our history have the world economies been so integrated. When people ask me about business, they usually ask questions around 4 areas. 5, everybody asks me the first question right away, so I get it out of the way off the top, which is, they ask me about Kevin O'Leary, and yes, he really is like that in real life. The other 4 things that people want to know about: number 1, jobs, obviously. Will I have one? Where are the opportunities going to be? Number 2, inflation. How much is stuff going to cost in the future? Will my wages keep up? Number 3, debt. If I have to borrow to buy something that I want or I need, am I going to be able to make those payments and eventually pay off the debt? And number 4, of course, is retirement. Will I be able to stop working at a reasonable age and live comfortably for, hopefully, a couple of decades? These are the most important financial questions in the world to every one of us, and the answer is the same to everyone. It depends. It depends what happens in the emerging markets in China. It depends what happens in Europe. It depends what happens in the United States, our biggest trading partner. And that is because the world's economies have never before been so integrated. If you don't understand what is happening globally, you can't make sound financial plans. I really believe that, and yet so often people who don't work on Bay Street tell me that they don't follow international business, either because they don't understand it, or worse, because they find it dull, which is just a knife to the heart. I think it means as well, that we as business journalists are failing, because the fact is, most days, if you look at the news of the day, the most important stories in the world come back to business. Who has money and who doesn't? Unfortunately, they're not easy stories to explain, especially on television. I challenge you to find anyone who can explain the European sovereign debt crisis in 30 seconds. It's easy in 30 seconds to talk about a meat recall, about the latest gadget from iPhone, maybe about the fact that gas prices are going to go up a couple of cents ahead of a long weekend. These are our favorite stories, right? You hear them over and over again on the news. It is not easy to talk about how a third round of quantitative easing by the US Federal Reserve is going to affect millions of people, including Canadians. The short answer is it's keeping your mortgage rates low. How it's doing that takes a little more time to explain. Luckily for me, I have you people trapped for the next 17 minutes. My husband says if you give a business journalist a captive audience, frankly, you're asking for it. I thought I would take you on a tour of a couple of the places that I've worked over the last 15 years and look at some of the crises that we've seen there and then bring it back to how it affects those four things that we all care about most. It is going to get a little bit dense. I have a lot of content in this speech. If anyone gets lost, feel free to heckle, because among other things, I am paid to debate with Kevin O'Leary, so I can take anything. We'll start with Europe. The Governor of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney, has made it clear that Europe is the single biggest external threat facing Canada right now. In 1999, the year the euro was officially announced to the world, Reuters transferred me to London from Tokyo, and it was a euphoric time. We did dozens of shows on what this new common currency was going to mean for the eurozone, and the answer was always, it can only be good. 10 years, right? 10 years is how long it took for this entire experiment to reach the brink of disaster. So what went wrong? The hope, obviously, was that closer economic integration would create advantages, but the deal in the eurozone is not like any other free trade agreement you're familiar with. It's not like NAFTA. In Europe, we have 17 countries who have now agreed to a common currency. But because they're not one country, they don't share the wealth evenly. They don't make common decisions about how to spend that wealth, how much they're going to spend on roads, whether they should borrow to pay for those roads. And so there's an unevenness built into that system right from the start. Now, they put restrictions in place from the beginning to try to keep all the countries on roughly the same page, but they disintegrated at the first sign of pressure. So I'll give you an example. Under the terms of the European Stability Pact, every Eurozone country has to get its national debt down to less than 60% of GDP, of what it earns, essentially. Last year, Germany had a national debt equal to 83% of GDP, and it is the strongest country in the Eurozone. Greece was twice that at 170%. The Eurozone average debt was 88%. In the Eurozone, nobody is even close to the debt threshold they agreed that everybody had to reach in order to succeed. So you can see we have a problem. By comparison, if anyone's curious, Canada has a national total debt of 32% of GDP. Yay us, right? We also have a pressure valve that we can use when our relationships with our trading partners become economically uneven, and this is a key point. We let our currency fluctuate. This is why when I moved back to Canada in 2002, the Canadian dollar was worth 64 US cents, and a decade later it's worth more than $1. In Europe, they can't do that. So when things go off the rails, their hands are in a lot of ways tied. I'll give you another example. Germany's books overall, even with that 83% national debt, are in way better shape than those of Greece. And yet a German euro is worth the same as a Greek euro. So how can that be fair? The big institutional investors out there, sometimes called the smart money, know that it's not. And so they've been demanding higher and higher interest rates to lend money to Greece. And not just to Greece. A lot of Eurozone countries are now caught in this trap, a vicious cycle, where they are borrowing more and more just to make the interest payments on their debt, which keeps rising because the interest rates keep rising. And so you've seen hundreds of billions of dollars in bailout money so far pumped into Greece, Ireland, and Portugal. Some of that money has come from Canada. There's fear that Spain or Italy will be next. Spain, in fact, I read an article this morning, people are speculating it could happen in days. And the social cost is enormous. Unemployment throughout the Eurozone is soaring. In Greece, youth unemployment is 55%. Think about what that means for a society for a moment. It's no wonder there have been riots. How does it affect Canada? At a minimum, of course, Europe is a major trading partner. It buys almost $30 billion a year of our stuff. Between July of this year and last, our exports to the European Union fell 7.4%. That's more than $2 billion wiped off our books. So what happens if the European recession lasts for years or the eurozone experiment collapses? Maybe I should give you some good news now. There is evidence that this too shall pass. There are a lot of parallels between what's going on in Europe right now and the Asian economic crisis of the late 90s. That one began, some of you will remember, with Thailand, which had a crushing foreign debt load. And like Greece, it couldn't adjust by letting its currency weaken because back in 1997, the Thai baht was pegged to the US dollar. I covered the Asian economic crisis from the beginning to the end. In late June of 1997, Reuters actually sent me to scrum Thailand's finance minister, Tanong Bidaya. I was in my 20s. It was my first major political scrum. It was a real 60 minutes, shove the microphone in the guy's face kind of thing. And being, a polite Canadian, I was actually quite intimidated. I was worried that I wasn't going to be aggressive enough to keep up with all of the other reporters. What I didn't realize, being new to Japan at the time, was that in cultural terms, compared to the Japanese, Canadians are not actually all that polite. I'm also 5'9". I wear heels, so I had a competitive advantage over the field, and so I shoved my way to the front of the crowd. I pushed the microphone in front of the finance minister's face. I fired off question after question. I literally did not let anyone else get a word in edgewise, and as a reporter, it was a moment of great personal triumph. The best clip that I got that day, the one that made international news, was about the Thai baht. I asked Tanong Bidaya if Thailand would change the rules and let it devalue. And he looked me in the eye and said no. 2 days. 2 days later, Thailand devalued the baht, triggering the start of the Asian economic crisis and proving one of the great axioms of journalism. You only have to be right for a day. You have no idea how we cling to that. So Thailand let the baht weaken, its stock market collapsed, it took bailout funds from the IMF, and the crisis spread across Asia. Does it sound familiar? It's exactly what's happening in Europe right now. From the ground, I can tell you that it felt like the end of the world. And yet, within 2 years, there were signs of recovery. And of course, in this millennium, Asia has come roaring back. Can anyone name the country that is the biggest car manufacturer in the world? Camera one? It's China. It has been for the last 3 years, and it probably will be for the next 20. What about the world's biggest brand of beer? Budweiser used to be. Heineken is a sort of a good... Did somebody say Tsingtao? Tsingtao would be a good guess. It's not actually. It's Snow Brand, which is a Chinese beer that's not even available in Canada, but last year it sold 16.5 billion pints. This year, China's economy is expected to grow 7.7%. Canada is expected to grow maybe 2% if we're lucky. The US is going to be lower than that, and Europe's economy is actually going to shrink. So in economic terms, 7.7% looks pretty good. 2 years ago, China's economy was growing 10% a year, though. So what we know is that it is slowing, and it's slowing quickly. I could do another 20 minutes on why China is slowing, and I'm tempted. But for today, it's enough to stress that even though this time we're looking at an Asian slowdown rather than a full-blown crisis, it's having a disproportionately large effect. And that is, again, because never have the world's economies been so integrated. Here in Canada, also Australia, even a slight slowdown in China is significant because we're such major suppliers of the raw materials that are feeding that growth story. The good news is China isn't yet our biggest trading partner, the US is, and the US is getting healthier after being hit by its own crisis in 2008. The bad news about the US is that, as you all know, it is a very slow recovery that we're seeing. I like to tell people that I was actually working in the US at the birth of the subprime debt crisis. Talk about an ugly baby. I joined Reuters in Chicago in 1995 when Chicago was the center of this flashy new world of derivatives trading. It was an area that was attracting the best and brightest, right? The real mathematical hotshots in the United States. And it was an interesting place to be a female business reporter. There were almost no women on the floors of the exchanges where I was supposed to go every day to get my stories. The trading pits were packed with this kind of sweaty, testosterone-fueled expanse of male capitalism. Unbelievable stress, insane amounts of money being made by guys in their 20s. I worked on a desk with 6 other reporters, and one of my colleagues, Christine Romans, who's now at CNN, actually wrote a story at the time about traders who were having their custom-made shoes fitted with custom lifts to just gain that extra little bit of height so they could actually see across the floor and have the tiniest advantage over the other traders. It was literally American-style capitalism at its purest and most terrifying. I say terrifying because even then, people knew that they were playing with fire. We don't have time for me to explain how derivatives have evolved over the past decade, but I want to tell you that originally they were designed to make the market safer and more efficient, and there is no greater irony in business. The problem, of course, and this is something I've come to learn over 2 decades, is that there really is nothing more creative than an institutional investor scenting money. And so it didn't take long for these guys to figure out that they could use derivatives to gamble. Derivatives, of course, are investments that are derived from something real, from gold, stock, some sort of commodities. And then the math hotshot stepped in and started making derivatives on all kinds of products, and then derivatives on the derivatives. And the pieces of paper got further removed from anything real until you had this enormous industry worth trillions of dollars trading, among other things, fragments of unhealthy US mortgages. And we all know what happened next. You didn't even have to see the US housing market slow. It just had to grow more slowly before the whole house of cards came tumbling down. And of course, then housing prices did collapse, and 4 years later, the average American is still paying the price. The fallout from that 4 years later is not the only problem the US is dealing with, clearly. Anyone here who hasn't heard about the looming fiscal cliff should go home tonight and look it up on Wikipedia. I always give homework. It's a full topic in and of itself, but for now I'll just say that it is the next big threat facing the United States and therefore everyone else in the world, and it's 2 months away. The fiscal cliff. Looming fiscal cliff. You can take the looming out, just Google fiscal cliff. On that note, that finishes sort of the global portion of today's tour. I did promise I was going to bring it back to Canada and those 4 things we care about. So very quickly, let's go through jobs, inflation, debt, and retirement. Jobs, good news, which you may have noticed I dole out very sparingly. If you wanted to lift people's spirits after Brian, you shouldn't have put a business journalist up on the stage. The jobs picture in Canada is definitely getting better. It is patchy. Most of the gains are out west because there's still fairly strong global demand out there for our resources, whereas obviously anywhere with a manufacturing base like Ontario is suffering more because our dollar is so strong. Hopefully, the stronger patches are going to be able to hold up, and in the meantime, we're going to see business across Canada everywhere doing everything it can to become more competitive. But if that doesn't happen, if the global situation as well worsens, that's going to be difficult. So how do you act on that? If you've got a good job, you might want to sit tight for a few years until it's clear how all of this, especially what's going on in Europe, is going to fall out. If you're looking to change jobs, think carefully about the industries that will be hurt the most if the global picture deteriorates. You might want to think about who, for example, your future employer actually does business with. In times of cutbacks, the public sector is obviously not a good bet. If you have kids, you should talk to them about future opportunities in emerging markets. You should encourage them to be multilingual. If you can't stand the thought of them working someday on the other side of the world, you should at least point them towards jobs that are tied to resources, or maybe cities that are tied to resources. Because if we don't manage to become more productive, as a country, more competitive internationally, it may be easier for a few decades to be a doctor or a teacher in Calgary, frankly, than in Toronto. Inflation, number 2, the biggest economic wild card out there. It's a point of enormous dissent among global economists. Last week, the IMF cut its forecast for global growth again. In normal times, you would expect slow growth would contain inflation, but things are not normal. We've had a decade of low interest rates. We've had central banks around the world printing vast amounts of money. And so it is possible that we could see a situation where the global economy stays weak and yet inflation rises. It's possible. And certainly, if the global economy improves, prices are going to have to go up. So at some point in our not too distant futures, things are going to cost more, possibly a lot more, and we need to start thinking now about our spending choices, which brings me to number 3, debt. The latest numbers out this week show that Canadian household debt is at an all-time high. This is the biggest potential trap for everyone in this room. When inflation arrives, the Bank of Canada is going to try to control it by raising interest rates. That's what central banks do. The commercial banks will follow suit, and that means the cost of your mortgage, your car loans, your student loans, your credit cards, all of that is going to go up. The only reason the Bank of Canada hasn't raised interest rates already is because the rest of the world isn't. And if we lead the pack, our Canadian dollar will strengthen even more, which hurts our exports. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I talked about the Federal Reserve and quantitative easing at the beginning of the talk. That is the reason why you can thank the US Fed for the fact that your mortgage rates are low right now. How do you use that? The Fed has promised to keep its interest rates near zero into 2015, so we have a few years to prepare. But anyone with debt needs to look at their books to figure out if they would be okay if interest rates rose a percentage point or 2 or 3, and that's conservative, right? If you have a 5-year mortgage, the bank doesn't have to give you the same rate. They may not even renew your mortgage. Make sure your books are in good shape before you have that meeting. And finally, number 4, because I am almost out of time, I just want to say it is so much easier to do this at a time when there's someone in your ear threatening to go to commercial or, shut up. Retirement is a very simple equation, right? It depends how much we earn and save versus how much we spend in the decades leading up to retirement. The problem is all of those things, as I hope I've established, depend on global factors as well. The worse the global picture gets, the more conservative you have to be in terms of how you retire. You have to save more and think less. You have to think about how you're saving, the types of assets you have. If inflation is coming, you don't want cash under the bed in a mattress because cash becomes worth less in an inflationary environment. I'm not a financial advisor. I can't give financial advice, but talk to yours about things that survive inflation. Hard assets, commodities, precious metals, land, things like that have traditionally done well. And I guess just to wrap up, I'll leave you with 2 points. The first I hope you take away today is that international business is fascinating. It sounds facetious, but I think it's fascinating. Putting the pieces of the puzzle together, being able to talk about it, understand how all this works is just intrinsically interesting. But the second point to remember is a little more actionable, and that is that when global winds are changing, you have to adjust your financial planning accordingly. So you nail the shutters closed when the big storms are coming, you open them up again when things are looking better, and I think that will happen. I really do believe this too shall pass. So in the meantime, stay alert, stay engaged, which is the point of today, and look out for the guys wearing the really tall shoes.